The restaurant was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that made every sound sharper, every whisper more noticeable. The clinking of glasses, the shuffle of chairs, the soft background music. All of it felt heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. Emma, a young waitress who had been working double shifts for weeks, wiped down a table near the back corner. She wasn't used to seeing so many unfamiliar faces, but that night the place was buzzing with people who clearly weren't regulars. Expensive suits, polished shoes, watches that gleamed under the warm lights. It was obvious the restaurant had been chosen for someone important. Emma didn't think much of it at first. For her work was routine. She took orders, balanced trays, and forced polite smiles even when exhaustion pressed down on her. Life had been difficult ever since her mother passed away when she was just a teenager. Her memories of her mom came in fragments. Laughter in the kitchen, a warm hug before school, the way she used to hum old songs while cleaning. The pain of losing her had never faded, but Emma had learned to keep going, even if every day felt like she was missing a piece of herself. But that night something was different. The buzz in the air wasn't just because of the moneyed crowd. It was because of him. Billionaire. A man whose name carried weight in newspapers, on TV, and across boardrooms. Richard Hale. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and instantly became the center of it. People leaned toward him when he spoke. His smile carried power. His presence demanded attention, and his wealth set him apart from everyone else in the room. Emma had seen his face before, on magazine covers and business headlines, but never in person. She couldn't deny the curiosity that bubbled inside her as she caught glimpses of him from across the dining hall. For most of the staff, serving him was a chance to impress, maybe even earn a bigger tip or a connection. For Emma, it was just another table, until her eyes landed on something she couldn't ignore. Richard Hale was seated at the largest table in the corner, surrounded by his entourage. They were laughing, exchanging stories, enjoying glasses of wine. And then he pulled out a photo from his wallet. At first, it seemed like a casual moment, something he wanted to share with the people around him. But Emma's heart nearly stopped when her gaze fell on the image. Her breath caught in her throat. She froze in place, tray trembling in her hands. She blinked once, then twice, convinced her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. But they weren't. The picture in Richard Hale's hand wasn't just any photograph. It was her mother. Emma's pulse quickened. The room seemed to blur around her, voices fading, laughter dimming. All she could see was the photo, the familiar smile, the soft hair, the warmth in her mother's eyes that Emma thought only she carried in memory. But there it was, in the hands of a billionaire she had never met before. Questions flooded her mind, crashing into each other so fast she could barely breathe. How did he have that photo? Why would a man like Richard Hale keep a picture of her mother? What connection could there possibly be between a billionaire and a woman who had lived an ordinary, modest life? Emma's legs felt weak as she approached his table. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she couldn't stop herself. Something deep inside her, part anger, part desperation, pushed her forward. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. This was personal. This was her mother. When she finally stood beside his table, her voice was unsteady, but her words cut through the noise like a blade. "Sir, that photo," she whispered, her hands trembling at her sides. "That's my mom." The table went silent. Richard Hale looked up, his confident smile faltering. The people around him exchanged confused glances, unsure if they had heard her correctly. Emma's eyes didn't leave the photograph in his hand. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought the entire room could hear it. Richard studied her, his expression unreadable. He slowly set the photo on the table, but he didn't let go of it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Your mother?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with something sharper. Emma nodded, her throat dry, her voice cracking as she forced the words out. "Yes, that's my mom." "Where did you get that picture?" The room felt frozen in time. Even the soft background music seemed distant. For a moment, it was just the two of them, Emma, trembling with shock, and Richard Hale, a man with everything, holding a secret she wasn't ready to face. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Then, almost reluctantly, he turned the photograph face down on the table. His voice was low, almost heavy as he said, "This isn't the time or the place." Emma's heart sank. The way he spoke, the look in his eyes. It was as if he knew something she didn't, something she wasn't meant to know. The room around them resumed its noise, but inside Emma's chest, the storm only grew louder. She wanted to shout, to demand answers, to grab the photo and run. But Richard's silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. It told her one thing clearly. There was a truth here, a truth that connected him to her mother. And whatever that truth was, it wasn't going to be simple. Emma stood there, torn between duty as a waitress and the ache in her chest as a daughter. She could feel her world shifting beneath her feet. One photograph had changed everything. And as Richard Hale finally slid the picture back into his wallet, his eyes met hers once more. His expression was guarded, but his words were chilling in their simplicity. "Some things," he said quietly, "are better left buried." Emma's breath caught. Her chest tightened. What could he possibly mean by that? She knew in that moment that this was only the beginning. The answer she had searched for her entire life, the missing pieces about her mother, the questions she had learned to live with, were suddenly closer than ever. But they were locked behind the guarded gaze of a billionaire who clearly knew more than he was willing to say. And as Emma stood frozen, her hands trembling, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, she realized something terrifying. The truth she was about to uncover might not heal her heart at all. Might break it. Would Richard Hale finally reveal the connection he had to her mother? Or was Emma about to walk into a world of secrets she wasn't ready to face? The answer hung in the silence, just out of reach, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Emma stood frozen beside the billionaire's table, her pulse racing so fast she could hardly think straight. Richard Hale's words echoed in her ears. "Some things are better left buried." They stung, not only because of the coldness in his tone but because of the mystery they carried. Her mother had lived a simple life, working long hours to make ends meet, never hinting at any secrets or connections to powerful men. At least, that's what Emma had always believed. Now, faced with the undeniable truth that Richard Hale carried her mother's photo, Emma's world felt like it was unraveling. She forced herself to step back, clutching her notepad like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. The guests at his table resumed their conversations, though their laughter seemed slightly strained now, as if everyone had felt the chill in the air from the brief exchange. Richard didn't look at her again, but the image of his guarded expression burned in Emma's mind. She returned to her duties mechanically, her body moving but her thoughts spiraling. Every plate she carried, every drink she poured, she could feel the weight of that photo pressing down on her. After her shift, Emma slipped into the staff room, her hands still trembling as she reached for her coat. The night outside was cool, the streets dimly lit, but she barely noticed. Her head was spinning with questions. Why had Richard Hale dismissed her so quickly? If it was just a coincidence, if he simply happened to have a photo of someone who looked like her mother, why not explain it? Why hide it? His reaction told her one thing clearly. He knew more than he was willing to admit. On her walk home, she thought back to her mother. Emma had been only 16 when she died, too young to understand the weight of adulthood but old enough to remember the loneliness that followed. Her mother, Maria, had never talked about her past. She avoided questions about her younger years, about where she had lived before Emma was born. There were no old family photos, no relatives who came to visit, no stories about her childhood. At the time, Emma had brushed it off as normal. Some people just didn't like to talk about the past. But now, looking back, she realized how strange it really was. Emma pushed open the door to her small apartment and sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall. She wanted to let it go, to convince herself that it was nothing, that she had imagined the resemblance. But deep down she knew the truth. That photo was her mother. She could never mistake her face, not after years of holding on to those precious memories. And Richard Hale's reaction was proof enough that something was being hidden. The next day, Emma couldn't focus on anything at work. Every time the door opened, she half expected to see him walk back in. When customers spoke to her, she smiled and nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Finally, during a short break, she pulled out her phone and searched Richard Hale's name. Dozens of articles appeared instantly. Business deals, charity events, glamorous parties. He was everywhere, photographed beside politicians, celebrities, and powerful figures from around the world. But nowhere, not once, did Emma see her mother's face connected to him. That only made the mystery deeper. Why would a man like him keep her mother's photo private? Was it something personal? Something he didn't want the world to know? Emma thought about asking her co-workers if they had noticed anything unusual, but she stopped herself. This was too personal, too fragile to share casually. Instead, she decided to dig quietly, to see if she could piece together anything from the fragments of her mother's life that she still remembered. That night, she pulled out the small wooden box she kept at the back of her closet. It was the only thing she had left of her mother's belongings. Inside were a few faded letters, a bracelet, and a recipe book with handwritten notes in the margins. Emma sifted through them carefully, searching for anything that could connect her mother to Richard Hale. Most of it was ordinary, filled with everyday reminders of a woman who worked hard and loved her daughter deeply. But then she noticed something she had overlooked before, a folded piece of paper tucked inside the recipe book. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. It was an old envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed to her mother but never opened. The sender's name was partially smudged, but Emma could still make out the last name, Hale. Her chest tightened as she stared at it, her mind racing. The letter was dated years before she was born. Emma pressed the envelope to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. This wasn't a coincidence. Her mother and Richard Hale had known each other somehow. But why had her mother never mentioned it? Why had she hidden it away? And what would the letter reveal if she dared to open it? She hesitated, her heart pounding as though the paper itself carried a warning. Finally, with trembling fingers, she slid the letter out. The handwriting was neat, careful, almost formal. She read the first line, and her breath caught in her throat. "Maria, I don't know how else to say this, but I need you to understand." Her vision blurred with tears as she read the words. Whoever had written the letter cared deeply for her mother. But the deeper she read, the more unsettling it became. There were mentions of difficult choices, of danger, of secrets that could not be spoken aloud. And at the end, one sentence made her blood run cold. "If anyone ever asks, you must deny knowing me." Emma dropped the letter onto the table, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Her mother had been keeping secrets her entire life, secrets that somehow involved Richard Hale. Suddenly, the billionaire's cold response made sense. He hadn't been surprised because of the photo. He had been caught off guard that Emma recognized it. But why? What could possibly tie her mother to a man like him? Emma barely slept that night, tossing and turning as questions consumed her. By morning, she felt hollow, but a fire burned in her chest. She needed answers. The letter had only deepened the mystery, and Richard Hale was the only person who could tell her the truth. At work later that week, Emma overheard two customers whispering about him. They mentioned he was hosting a private charity gala in the city. The moment she heard it, her decision was made. She would find a way in, no matter how impossible it seemed. Because Emma couldn't keep living with half-truths and buried secrets. She deserved to know who her mother really was. And she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the connection that Richard Hale was so desperate to hide. What Emma didn't realize, though, was that some truths were far more dangerous than she imagined. By chasing them, she was stepping into a world of power, betrayal, and heartbreak that could change her life forever. As she folded the letter and slipped it back into the box, one thought lingered in her mind like a shadow. If Richard Hale had loved her mother, or even betrayed her, what would that make him to Emma? A stranger? An enemy? Or something far more complicated? The answer waited in the silence, hidden just beyond reach. And Emma knew she was about to walk straight into it, whether she was ready or not. Emma couldn't shake the heaviness that clung to her after finding the letter. Every detail of her mother's quiet life seemed to blur against the sharp edges of what she had just uncovered. For years she had believed Maria had been nothing more than an ordinary woman, a loving mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her. Now, those memories felt like fragments of a story she had never been told in full. The envelope had shattered the illusion. Richard Hale wasn't just some powerful man in the background of her world. He was directly tied to it, and maybe even to her. The following days stretched on like a fog. Emma went to work, smiled at customers, and carried trays as if nothing had changed. But inside her heart was restless. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard's face at the restaurant, the way his smile had faltered when she spoke. His guarded expression wasn't something she could forget. It wasn't just surprise. It was recognition. He knew her mother. That certainty burned inside her. Emma decided she had no choice but to pursue the only lead she had, the charity gala. It wasn't the kind of place she belonged, but she couldn't let that stop her. She borrowed a dress from a coworker, something simple but elegant, and spent what little savings she had on shoes that pinched her feet but looked decent enough. She told herself she would only watch from the sidelines, just long enough to get close enough to speak with Richard Hale again. But in her heart, she knew she was chasing more than answers. She was chasing a piece of her identity. The night of the gala, the city lights shimmered against the glass windows of the grand hall. Luxury cars lined the entrance, photographers clustered outside, and laughter floated into the night air as guests made their way inside. Emma felt small as she walked through the doors, her borrowed dress doing little to hide the fact that she didn't belong. But she kept her chin high, her mother's letter tucked safely in her purse. Inside, the atmosphere was overwhelming. Waiters in crisp uniforms weaved between groups carrying champagne, the music was soft but grand, and chandeliers sparkled overhead. Emma scanned the room nervously until she spotted him, Richard Hale. He was standing at the center of a crowd, smiling easily, shaking hands, as if the world bent itself around him. But as Emma watched him, a strange thought struck her. He looked almost tired. Behind the charm and confidence, there was something guarded, something weary, as if the weight of secrets pressed against him too. She started to move toward him, her hands clammy, but before she could get close, someone brushed past her. A woman in a silver gown, tall and graceful, leaned in to whisper something to Richard. He nodded slightly, his smile never faltering, but his eyes flickered in the woman's direction with a look Emma couldn't quite read. Emma paused, retreating into the crowd. She realized this wasn't going to be as simple as walking up and demanding answers. Richard was surrounded by people, by layers of wealth and influence that kept outsiders like her at a distance. She needed a plan, a way to reach him without drawing attention. As she lingered near the edge of the room, a voice startled her. "You don't look like you belong here." Emma turned to see a young man standing beside her. His suit wasn't as sharp as the others, and his tie was slightly crooked, but his eyes were sharp and observant. She felt her cheeks flush. I'm just here for the gala," she said quickly, though the words sounded weak even to her. The man raised an eyebrow. "Most people here are here to be seen. You're watching. There's a difference." Emma hesitated. Something about his tone unnerved her, but also made her curious. "And what about you? Why are you here?" He smiled faintly. "Let's just say I'm watching too." Before she could ask more, Richard Hale moved toward the stage to give a speech. The crowd shifted, clapping politely as he stepped up to the microphone. Emma's stomach knotted as his deep voice filled the room. He spoke of generosity, of building opportunities for communities in need, of leaving a legacy of change. The audience applauded warmly, but Emma couldn't help hearing an edge in his voice, as if his words were meant for more than the crowd in front of him. As the applause echoed, Emma's mind returned to the letter. "If anyone ever asks, you must deny knowing me." The words seemed to echo louder with every passing moment. What could her mother have been caught in? Why would Richard, a billionaire, need to hide their connection? The young man beside her leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're not the only one asking questions about him." Emma's eyes widened, but before she could respond, he slipped back into the crowd and disappeared. Her heart raced. Who was he? What did he mean? The rest of the night blurred. Emma tried again to approach Richard, but he left quickly after his speech, disappearing behind a curtain with a woman in silver. Emma followed, but security blocked the hallway before she could get near. Defeated, she left the gala, her thoughts spiraling faster than ever. Back in her apartment, she unfolded the letter once more, reading the careful handwriting until the words imprinted themselves in her mind. There was something else hidden between the lines, she felt it. Something about the way her mother's name had been written with such tenderness. Something about the urgency in the warnings. Days passed, and Emma's life felt split in two. By day, she continued working shifts at the restaurant, pouring coffee, serving meals, smiling politely. By night she searched. She read articles, dug into archives, and even visited the library, hoping for anything that connected Maria to Richard Hale. What she found were fragments, business records, mentions of partnerships, charitable ventures, but none of it answered the one question that consumed her. Why had her mother been told to deny knowing him? Meanwhile, the young man from the gala appeared again, this time outside the restaurant. Emma spotted him leaning against a lamppost as her shift ended. He approached her calmly, his expression serious. "You're not going to find the answers in newspapers," he said softly. "You're digging into something much bigger than you realize." Emma crossed her arms, her suspicion rising. "And how would you know that?" "Because I've been digging too," he replied. "And I think your mother was part of something she never wanted you to know about." Emma's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" The man glanced around before lowering his voice. "Richard Hale isn't the man the world thinks he is. And if your mother was connected to him, then you deserve to know the truth. But it won't be easy." Emma felt both fear and determination ignite in her. The mystery wasn't just about a photo anymore. It was about her mother's life, her choices, and the hidden world Emma was being pulled into. And with each step, the danger seemed to grow. She realized then that every answer she uncovered would only lead to deeper questions. And somewhere at the center of it all stood Richard Hale, a man who could unlock the truth but who seemed determined to keep it buried. The thought haunted her as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. She had started this search hoping for closure, maybe even healing. But what if the truth didn't heal her? What if it shattered everything she thought she knew about her mother and herself? Emma knew she couldn't turn back now. But as shadows stretched across her apartment walls, a quiet fear settled in her chest. Some truths didn't just change lives. They destroyed them. And the one she was chasing had the power to do both. The night air was sharp against Emma's skin as she stood outside her apartment, the young man's warning still echoing in her ears. He had given her no name, no details. Only a promise that her mother's connection to Richard Hale was deeper and darker than she could imagine. She wanted to demand answers, but he slipped away into the crowd like a shadow. The silence that followed was louder than anything he had said. Emma barely slept. The pieces of her life no longer fit together, and the weight of secrets pressed down harder with each passing day. Every memory of her mother seemed suddenly incomplete, like a picture with the edges torn off. The thought that Richard Hale held the missing pieces consumed her. But each time she pictured his eyes, calm and guarded, she felt the tension coil tighter. He wasn't just hiding something, he was protecting it. And Emma couldn't decide if that made him dangerous or simply desperate. Her chance came sooner than she expected. A notice in the paper announced that Richard Hale would be attending a closed business conference at a downtown hotel. The public wasn't invited, but Emma knew she couldn't sit back any longer. She had to face him. She had to force him to tell her what he knew about her mother. The hotel shimmered with glass and steel, its lobby filled with the murmur of expensive voices. Emma slipped in quietly, her heart pounding, dressed in the same borrowed dress from the gala. This time, she didn't plan on watching from the edges. She scanned the crowd until she spotted him. Richard, surrounded by executives, his presence commanding as always. But tonight Emma noticed something else. His eyes carried the same weariness she had glimpsed before, as if the mask of the billionaire grew heavier with each day. She waited for her moment. When Richard finally stepped away from the group, Emma's feet carried her forward before her mind could stop her. She blocked his path, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "You can't keep avoiding me," she said. "That photo, you owe me the truth." For a second Richard froze. Then he looked at her with something between anger and sorrow. "This isn't the place," he said quietly, echoing the same words from the restaurant. Emma shook her head. "You've been saying that. But I don't care about the place. I care about my mother. You knew her. Why won't you admit it?" The sharpness in her voice drew glances from those nearby. Richard's jaw tightened. He placed a hand on her arm, not harshly, but firmly enough to steer her toward a quieter hallway. Once they were out of earshot, his voice dropped. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said. "The truth. It's not what you think. And it's not safe for you." Emma's chest tightened. "Not safe. She was my mother. You think I care about safe? I deserve to know what you're hiding." Richard looked at her for a long moment. His eyes filled with a conflict she couldn't read. He seemed about to speak, but then his expression hardened. "You should walk away," he said. "For your own good." Before Emma could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. She turned to see the woman in the silver gown from the gala approaching, her expression sharp and watchful. Richard's demeanor shifted instantly, his voice smoothing back into calm. "Go home, Emma," he murmured under his breath. "Before it's too late." Then he walked away, leaving her standing in the shadows, trembling with frustration. Emma's anger burned hotter than ever. Every time she got close, he pushed her back. Every time she demanded the truth, he buried it deeper. But his words haunted her. Not safe. What danger could possibly be tied to her mother's past? The following days only deepened her unease. The young man appeared again, slipping her a folded note while she worked. The handwriting was rushed. "Meet me at the old train station. Midnight. You need to see this." Emma's hands shook as she read the words. A part of her screamed not to go, that it was reckless and dangerous. But the greater part of her, the part that had carried her this far, knew she had no choice. That night, the train station was dark and abandoned, its tracks rusting in the moonlight. Emma's footsteps echoed as she walked across the cracked concrete, her breath fogging in the cold air. She saw him waiting by the platform, his face tense. "I found something," he said quickly, holding out a folder. "Your mother wasn't just connected to Richard Hale. She was caught in something bigger, something that could ruin him if it came out." Emma opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, old documents, fragments of records that hinted at a past her mother had never shared. She saw her mother's name listed beside Richard's in old company files. She saw letters mentioning deals, promises, risks. And one document, stamped confidential, bore Richard Hale's signature alongside her mother's. Emma's throat went dry. "She worked with him," she whispered. The young man nodded. "But it wasn't just business. Look closer." Emma scanned the papers again, her heart hammering faster with every word. There were references to projects, to choices made in secret, to something that had gone terribly wrong. And in the margins of one paper, in handwriting she recognized as her mother's, were 3 words that froze her blood. "Protect my daughter." Her knees went weak. She gripped the folder tightly, her vision blurring. The pieces were sliding together, but the picture they formed terrified her. Whatever her mother had been involved in, she had carried the weight of it in silence, all to protect Emma. Suddenly, a sharp sound cracked through the night, a car door slamming shut. Emma and the young man turned. At the edge of the station's lot, a dark vehicle idled, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Two figures stepped out, their silhouettes tall and imposing. The young man's face paled. "They followed me," he muttered. "We have to go." Emma's heart thundered as the figures began to move closer. She clutched the folder to her chest, fear and determination colliding inside her. She didn't know who those men were or what they wanted, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was closer than ever to the truth. And Richard Hale was at the center of it all. The night air grew heavier as the figures approached, their steps echoing louder with each passing second. Emma's breath came fast, her pulse wild. She had chased answers for so long, but now the cost of knowing them pressed in from every side. Somewhere in the darkness, the truth waited, sharper and heavier than she had ever imagined. And as the headlights glared brighter, Emma realized she was standing at the very edge of it, about to uncover what her mother had died keeping hidden. But whether the truth would set her free or break her completely was something she was about to learn in the most dangerous way. The next day began with a strange tension in the air. The janitor arrived early, as he always did, pushing his cart down the hallway while humming softly to himself. The school felt heavier somehow, the kind of quiet that comes before something unexpected. He noticed whispers among the teachers, glances exchanged that he wasn't meant to see. The little girl he had comforted with bubbles was absent, and that absence sent a ripple through the halls. Even though no one spoke her name openly, he could feel her presence lingering like an echo. By lunchtime, the billionaire mother reappeared, this time not in a rush, not in disguise. She walked with an air of certainty, her eyes scanning the building as though she had been here before. She had money, influence, and power at her fingertips, but what unsettled her most was something money couldn't solve: the quiet resilience she had seen in her daughter and the unexpected role a stranger had played in calming her. She hadn't come here for a public show. She had come for answers. The janitor kept his head down when she entered, pretending to focus on mopping the floor. But she approached anyway, her heels clicking against the tiles like a countdown. "You," she said softly, her voice almost carrying a note of gratitude, almost. "You were with my daughter yesterday." He froze, unsure whether her tone carried kindness or accusation. "I was just doing my job," he replied carefully, his voice low. But the truth was more complicated. He had felt something stir in him that day, a reminder of his own past. His own daughter, long gone from his life for reasons he never spoke about. The billionaire mother studied his face as though trying to read a story written in the lines of his skin. "My daughter doesn't calm easily," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But she trusted you. Why?" The question wasn't simple, and he had no simple answer. He could only shrug. "Sometimes children see things in us adults forget we still carry," he said. "She just needed someone to slow the world down for her." Her expression faltered for a moment, but before the moment could soften further, the principal appeared with a forced smile, ushering her away to an office. The janitor turned back to his mop, but his hands trembled slightly. Something told him this wasn't the end of it. That evening, as he left the building, he noticed a black car idling near the curb. The tinted windows gave nothing away, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He tightened his grip on his old bag and walked home with quickened steps, his mind racing. Why would anyone care about a janitor who blew bubbles to comfort a child? Unless perhaps there was more at stake than he realized. The following morning, the whispers grew louder. Some of the staff began speculating openly about the billionaire's sudden visits and her interest in the janitor. Some hinted at connections, others at secrets. The janitor could feel the walls of the school tightening around him, like the building itself was holding a secret he wasn't meant to uncover. That afternoon, as he went about fixing a loose window in one of the classrooms, he found something unusual tucked behind the radiator. A small, folded note. At first, he thought it was just a student's scribble, but when he opened it, his stomach dropped. It wasn't written in a child's handwriting. It was neat, precise, and unsettlingly clear. "She remembers more than she should. Protect her." He stared at the words, his pulse quickening. Who had written it? Who had left it there? And what did it mean by she remembers more than she should? He tucked the note into his pocket, but the weight of it felt heavier than paper. Felt like a warning or perhaps a test. That night, the janitor couldn't sleep. He replayed the moment in his head when the little girl had looked at him through her tears. There had been something in her eyes, something beyond fear. A kind of recognition, as if she had seen him before in a place that couldn't exist. He shook his head, telling himself he was imagining things. But deep down, he knew this wasn't imagination. The next day brought another surprise. The billionaire mother returned again, this time with a man by her side. He wasn't dressed like her usual circle of business associates. He had a military stiffness about him, eyes that scanned every corner of the hallway with calculated precision. The janitor immediately recognized the type, someone used to keeping secrets. When their eyes met, it wasn't casual. The man looked at him too long, too intently, as though trying to place him. The janitor turned away quickly, but the unease stayed with him. He had stumbled into something bigger than himself, and now it was circling closer. Later that afternoon, as he swept near the library, he heard voices carrying through the slightly open office door. The billionaire's voice was sharp but hushed. She told me again. She insists she saw it. How could a child know something like that? The man replied, his tone lower but firm. Because someone's telling her. Or because she's remembering. Either way, we can't risk exposure. The janitor backed away slowly, heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know what they were talking about, but the words clung to him. Risk exposure. Exposure of what? And why did it feel like the little girl was at the center of it? As he left that day, the black car was there again. This time the window rolled down slightly. The same man from earlier leaned out, his voice steady but carrying an edge. You should be careful. Sometimes kindness draws attention from the wrong people. The janitor froze, unsure how to respond. He wanted to ask what they meant, wanted to demand answers. But before he could, the window rolled back up and the car drove away. That night, as he sat alone in his small apartment, the city's lights flickering faintly through the blinds, he pulled out the note again. She remembers more than she should. Protect her. He thought about the girl's absent smile, the way she had clung to him when the world had felt too heavy. He thought about the woman's guarded tone and the man's warning. And then he realized something chilling. This wasn't just about comfort or bubbles or kindness. Somehow, he had stepped into a story that wasn't his, a story that had been running long before he even knew it existed. And now, whether he wanted to or not, he was part of it. The school halls would never feel ordinary again. Every glance, every whisper, every shadow carried weight. He knew the climax of this story was coming, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what it would reveal. Would you like me to continue the next section by pushing the tension into a direct confrontation, like the janitor discovering what the girl actually remembers? Or would you prefer me to keep circling the mystery with more cryptic hints before the climax? The tension in the air reached its peak as Sarah and David stood at the heart of the old factory, the place where every strange lead had been pulling them. The dim light from broken windows cast long shadows across the floor, and the air carried the weight of secrets long buried. Sarah's hand tightened around her phone, her instincts screaming that the truth was finally within reach. David's eyes darted toward a rusted metal door, one that looked far too secure compared to the rest of the crumbling building. With steady breaths, they pushed forward, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Every detail around them whispered of something hidden: scattered papers, abandoned tools, and faint markings on the walls that seemed like codes. They had come too far to turn back now. David pressed against the door, and with a sudden force, it creaked open, revealing a hidden chamber behind it. The sight froze them in place. Inside were rows of files, maps, and photographs, all connected by strings on the wall like a web of secrets no one was meant to see. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes scanning the faces in the photos, and her breath caught when she recognized a figure she thought she'd never see there, the very billionaire who had been funding charities and presenting himself as a savior to the public. His smiling portrait, clipped from a newspaper, was circled in red. Beneath it, handwritten notes hinted at his involvement in keeping key information hidden, not exposing it. The realization struck Sarah hard. The man she once thought of as a benefactor was tied to the very mystery they had been unraveling. Before they could process further, a low sound echoed behind them. The same stranger who had been shadowing them for days now stood in the doorway. His expression calm yet unreadable. He spoke slowly, his words carrying a weight that made Sarah's pulse quicken. "You weren't supposed to find this," he said, his voice steady but laced with warning. David stepped protectively in front of Sarah, demanding answers, but the man only shook his head, hinting that the truth was too dangerous to speak out loud. The air between them thickened as silence stretched. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, with a sudden move, the stranger tossed a thick envelope toward Sarah's feet. "If you want to know the real story," he muttered, "take this and leave now." The envelope lay there like a ticking clock, daring them to make a choice. Sarah hesitated, torn between her fear and the fire inside her to uncover the truth. She bent down, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope just as the stranger whispered, "But know this, the closer you get, the more you risk everything." Sarah opened the envelope, and what she found shattered everything she thought she knew. Documents revealed that the billionaire had been manipulating events from the shadows, pulling strings not to help, but to protect himself. Yet the last page inside the envelope revealed a second, more chilling twist. The stranger himself was once part of the operation, someone who had broken away after discovering too much. His presence wasn't to stop Sarah, but to test if she was ready to carry the burden of truth. The realization hit like lightning. The climax of their search was not only about exposing lies but about making a choice. Sarah's heart raced as the stranger's eyes locked with hers, silently urging her to decide whether she was willing to step into his world of danger and secrets. Just as she found her voice to answer, the sound of engines roared outside the factory. Headlights pierced through the cracks in the walls, and the ground seemed to tremble. Someone else had arrived, someone who didn't want the truth revealed. The stranger's calm composure broke for the first time, his jaw tightening. He looked at Sarah and David with urgency. "You have only moments," he said. "Decide now. Take the truth and run, or lose it forever." His words were the final push into the storm, the twist that made it clear the game was far from over. And in that heartbeat, Sarah realized the story wasn't ending here. It was only beginning. When the chaos finally settled, it felt as if the world had paused for a long exhale. The room that had once been filled with fear and whispers of betrayal now carried a heavy silence, the kind that comes after storms have passed but before anyone knows how to pick up the pieces. Faces that had been twisted with anger or clouded by suspicion softened as the truth unraveled fully, and people looked at one another with a mix of shame, relief, and quiet understanding. The climax had stripped away the illusions that everyone had been clinging to, leaving only raw humanity in its wake. Janet stood at the center, her hands trembling but her voice steady. For so long she had been the one underestimated, overlooked, treated as if her presence didn't matter. Yet, in the end, she had been the one who revealed the truth, not out of vengeance but out of necessity. What shocked everyone most wasn't only what had been hidden, but the reminder of how easily assumptions could destroy lives. The billionaire mother, who had remained silent for much of the ordeal, finally spoke. Her words were not sharp or arrogant, but almost tender. She admitted she had misjudged, that her own pride had blinded her to the simple kindness that had sparked everything. For the first time, her hardened exterior cracked, and what emerged was not the figure of untouchable power but a mother whose heart had been shaken. The janitor, who had only wanted to protect a child in distress, was left speechless as people turned to him, not with scorn but with gratitude. He had never asked for recognition, but in that moment he received something far greater, respect. Parents who once would not have looked twice at him now came forward, thanking him for stepping in when no one else dared. Children who had seen his small gestures of kindness before now whispered about how brave he had been. For him, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about being human, about stepping into the gap when someone needed it most. As the dust cleared, smaller stories began to surface. The young girl, who had been at the center of so much, finally found her voice. Through tears, she explained that she hadn't known how to ask for help, that the weight she carried had felt unbearable. The bubbles that had seemed so small earlier had been the first thing to break through her panic, giving her a moment of calm. That memory alone stayed with everyone, a reminder that kindness doesn't have to be grand to change a life. Sometimes it's the smallest acts that leave the deepest mark. The billionaire mother, humbled, asked the janitor to share his side of the story publicly, not as a way to clear her name but as a way to set the record straight. She admitted her fault in judging him, and for once, her power was used not to control but to uplift. Her shift in tone sent ripples through everyone present. What had begun as suspicion and division ended as a call for unity, a reminder that humanity matters more than titles, wealth, or appearances. Even the staff, who had been quietly watching from the sidelines, found themselves reflecting. Some had kept silent out of fear, others out of habit, but now they realized the cost of silence. Their perspective shifted too. They began to see the janitor not as just another worker but as someone who had held more courage than most. The story of that day spread beyond the walls, whispered first among the children, then among the parents, and soon it made its way into wider circles. But the most surprising twist came quietly, almost too softly to notice at first. The girl's mother, after everything had been resolved, reached out to the janitor privately. She offered him something unexpected. Not money, not a position, but an opportunity. She asked him to help create a program in schools and community spaces, a safe place where children could go when they felt unheard, where simple gestures like blowing bubbles or listening without judgment could make a difference. It wasn't charity. It was partnership. She wanted to take what had been almost a tragedy and turn it into hope for countless others. For the janitor, it was overwhelming. He had never dreamed his small act could ripple so far. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he belonged in such a role, but then he remembered the look on the girl's face when she finally felt safe enough to speak. He realized it wasn't about him. It was about making sure no child ever felt alone again. Slowly he nodded, and with that choice, a new chapter began. The weeks that followed were filled with change. The school community, once fractured, began to heal. Teachers who had overlooked quiet moments of distress started paying closer attention. Parents who had been too busy to notice subtle cries for help became more present. And the girl, who had carried so much pain, found herself surrounded by support she had never imagined possible. She wasn't just the child from that day anymore. She was a reminder of resilience, of what happens when someone finally listens. The billionaire mother, though still powerful, walked with a softened air now. People noticed she smiled more, that she stopped to speak with those she once brushed past. Some said she had changed completely, others doubted it, but no one could deny that something within her had shifted. She had learned that wealth could buy many things but not the trust or love of those around her. That had to be earned. And in her own way, she began trying to earn it back. For the janitor, life didn't transform overnight. He still woke early, still swept the same floors, still wore the same uniform. But now when people saw him, they saw more than his role. They saw the man behind it. He no longer walked invisible. He walked respected. And though he never sought the spotlight, he carried himself differently, not with arrogance but with quiet dignity. In the end, the story was not about wealth versus poverty, or power versus humility. It was about the invisible threads of humanity that connect us all, threads so easily overlooked until they are tugged by crisis. It was about the reminder that kindness is not weakness, that small acts can tip the scales in ways we may never predict. And it was about second chances, how even those who seem hardened can learn, and how even those who feel unseen can rise to be the anchor in a storm. The final lesson lingered long after the day had ended. People carried it into their homes, their workplaces, their hearts. Whenever someone saw bubbles floating in the air after that, they didn't just see playfulness. They remembered that moment, that story, that choice to meet pain with kindness. And in remembering, they carried forward the hope that maybe, just maybe, humanity could shine through even in the darkest moments. The story closed not with a grand farewell but with a simple truth. The measure of who we are is not in what we own or how high we stand, but in how deeply we see others, and how far we are willing to go to lift them when they fall. And in that truth, everyone who had been part of it found their own quiet redemption.